Right, so this is me, I'm Roger Hallam, and I'm doing this sort of, well, it is a lecture, isn't it, really? It's a talk. Let's call it a talk, shall we? And sounds better. So, apologies that it's going to get a little bit, if you want to take a nap, that's fine. Watch it at home. Maybe no one wants to watch it. It's fine. I'm really pretty relaxed about it. Having said that, so I've been thinking about doing this talk for about 3/4 of a year. So it's a bit like it's the part 2 to the talk that I did to Rising Up in January 2018. And I did this talk sort of pivoting to the real issue for Rising Up, and you can see it and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, basically he says, the world's ready for mass civil disobedience on the climate crisis. Let's go and do it, because it's so bad that people will be willing to break the law. And if you were actually in the room at the time, you'd have realised how unusual that idea was at the time, because loads of people in the room were going, no. So that's my claim to fame, because 3 months later, there was a meeting in Bristol and everyone went, all right, let's go and do it. And that's how Extinction Rebellion got going and what have you. So this is based on that talk, which is part 2. And it's basically I'm going to sort of criticise some bits of it, if you see what I mean, because I think things have changed in a way that are quite challenging, let's put it like that. So this is called pivoting to the end game. So it's a bit like that's pivoting to get it going. And then this is pivoting to winning, in inverted commas, in so much as that's going to be possible or meaningful at this stage of the game. Okay, so it's all going to be pretty relaxed, even though we're talking about the end of the world. So I'm not going to be doing any big emotional things. We're just going to be looking at the intellectual side of it with our brains. And obviously that's not the whole shaboodle, as I will mention. But I'm not trying to get anyone to sort of start signing up to anything, right? I'm going to start with a few tangents. So regression to the mean is this thing where if a football team, it was in the States, so it's probably a baseball team, if they win 3 times in a row because of luck, right, they'll end up being on the front page of Newsweek, right? And they'll say, aren't they amazing? They've got on the front page of Newsweek, they've won 3 times, if you see what I mean. And there's this sort of joke that as soon as you get on the front page of Newsweek or whatever, or I think it was Time magazine, then they always lose the following time, because it's a bit of a cognitive error, which is, if you play football, you might just win 3 times out of luck, right? So in other words, it's not because they're better, it's just because they're lucky. And so more times than not, they will lose the following time, right? Because, it's nothing to do with them being that great. That was just luck. So you can see this with me. So you usually get some intellectual guy and he hits on something really good, and then, pivoting to the real issue and heading for extinction talk that I did. So this is my 3rd talk, and so people might think, oh, well, that's amazing, but it might be I might actually just be crap, and this is all crap. So that's my little humble bit. But my proposition is that this is the most important information in the world. I always like saying things like that, but that's because I think it is. But, it might be wrong. So I think that's really arrogant and outrageous and male, then so be it, because I could be wrong. But it's it happens to be my opinion. This is the most important information in the world. But obviously, I'm going to do it in a bit of a shit way because I'm really scruffy doing things. So someone will watch this video, hopefully, and make it all better. Because if you see my first heading for extinction talk, which was the first one, it was a little bit all over the place. But, that's great because other people took it off and messed around with it. Okay, so the general gist is that in pivoting to the real issue, I was saying the reason why climate change is such a headfuck is because it's universal, it's affecting everything, it's existential, which means everything is going to go extinct, and it's exponential, which means it's getting worse and worse. In other words, it's like a trinity from hell, right? It's like a nightmare. And the fourth element of it, which makes it even more like, if you were a sociologist in the sky, you'd just be writing off the human race, because it also is not happened properly yet. I mean, obviously it is happening, but it's not like killing millions of people. So I've just done this little thing here. So it's super bad. Everyone knows it's super bad, right? And it's not arrived yet. It's just in no particular way, and it's arrived a little bit, right? But in terms of, mass starvation and all the things, it's a long way. So it's the worst possible phenomenon for the human race, as we'll come on to identify. Because if it's really bad, but it's in your face, then people do something about it. You see what I mean? So we'll return to this theme a few times during the talk, because what I'm trying to do here is sort of identify the metaphysics of it, like the fundamental elements of it, if you see what I mean, strategically and philosophically or structurally. So you can see it's right up in the corner. So for instance, like, Boris Johnson is there. Do you see what I mean? So he's bad, he's pretty bad, but he's not, he's not Hitler. And he's right in your face because he's here now. Do you see what I mean? So you can see different things, you see what I mean, in different times and places. All right. So I'm going to say something about the climate situation, partially as an introduction to some key concepts, right? So one of the things I'm going to be banging on about, and hopefully you're all going to get your head around this, is what's called nonlinear dynamics or herding. And I'll describe this in a lot more detail. And it sounds really intellectual, but it's actually not that complicated once you get your head into it. And all the work I do is about nonlinear dynamics. Well, basically what nonlinear dynamics mean is one day you're walking along the road and then suddenly you fall in a hole. It's like everything's fine and then everything's off the cliff bad, right? And in systems, whether natural systems or social systems, often that's not the case, right? Things just trundle along. But in particular circumstances, you have these situations where you're just trundling along and then it goes, and everything falls apart. And we need to understand how that happens and why it happens, okay? And herding is one element of it. Herding basically means if everyone's doing X, everyone else does it. And this is related to us being mammals, and there's lots of research on it. So if everyone's being nice, as it were, everyone else is being nice. Like, at school, like everyone, you get into sixth form and everyone's like pretending to be nice. Do you remember that? I don't know. No. Anyway, so while, when you're 13, everyone's really horrible. So it's like everyone learns from people around them. So it's, that's just a silly example. So the other thing is a distribution curve. So like, here's a distribution curve, right? Most of society is in the middle, and then there's a little bit of people at one end and a little bit of people at the other end. So this is a fundamental analytical tool, which loads of people don't understand. They'll say, people do this, right? But people don't do this. They mainly do this, and some people do hardly any of this, and other people do loads of it. Do you see what I mean? But it always has that broad distribution, broadly speaking. In other words, most people in the middle, and you have, these are called the tails, by the way, in so much as that's useful. Okay, and the third thing to understand is this. So this is a little bit complicated. But basically, if you do something to a system, it's like, if I hit Ramon, like I'm doing something to Ramon, right? And then someone's going to say, if you hit Ramon, he's going to hit you back, okay? So, which is probably, might be right or might be wrong, right? But in a complex, like Ramon's fairly simple, as it were, his simple system, no disrespect. But if you are getting off the maybe a complex, yeah. Anyway, that's a bad example. But in a complex system, like you have loads of things happening. Okay, so there's loads of Ramons in this complex system. And so if you have loads of people, then what will happen is some will do Y and some will not do Y, if you see what I mean. So in other words, like, for instance, a little example is, if you put like people's rotting lungs on a cigarette packet, 80% of people will go, I don't want to do that. I'm going to do smoking. So they'll do Y, right? But a minority of people will go, great, I love death. You know, I'm going to have more cigarettes. Do you see what I mean? And I'm going to be a deaf person because I just like doing it. No disrespect to you who smoke. But anyway, so, you know, you can see these different things that happen. So when you're doing sophisticated analysis, it's not like will something cause something rather than something else. It's more like how much will it cause something and how much will it cause something else? You see what I mean? Because you need to be thinking about it. So a bit more. All right. So I'm just going to go a little on a bit about the climate situation because I think you can sort of partially because it's important as far as this video is concerned to establish we're actually talking about something beyond serious. All right. So I'm not going to go on about loads of stats, but we're familiar with this stat at the moment, which is 5 degrees centigrade by mid-century. 5 degrees centigrade is it's locked in. You know, it's not necessarily going to be mid-century, but quite possibly because of other things. But let's not worry about that. It's going to be 5 degrees centigrade, you know, and that's 10 degrees inland. That's 30 degrees on a hot day, right? So in terms of those concepts we've just talked about, right, people think there's two things going on. There's feedbacks and then there's cut-off points, I'm going to call them, right? So let's just deal with feedbacks. So one of the reasons people don't understand what's happening is they have a theoretical idea. Everyone has a theoretical idea of what's going on. They just don't know it, if you see what I mean. Everyone has a philosophy. They just don't know what it is. And so most people think, okay, so, you know, that sounds quite bad. But what they don't realise is that the Earth's geophysical system is like highly non-linear, right? What happens is, if you look in the long historical record, it flips from two steady states, which is around 23 degrees centigrade. And that's when there's no ice on the ice caps. And it's, you know, 20 degrees, 40 degrees in the Arctic. And there's tropical forests and alligators that used to be at the North Pole. And then it flips down to loads of ice, which is, you know, Ice Age. So you have a look. So what you tend to find is once the ice starts melting, it flips up really quickly to a new, because once all the ice is gone, then you're at a steady state. Do you see what I mean? Because the Earth has heated up. So the Earth mainly heats up because the ice is gone. I mean, this is simplistic, obviously. And then it returns. So you can see here that you can see this non-linear dynamic thing, which is you trigger something, then it's like knocking a ball down a hill. So you might say, oh, I've only knocked the ball, you know, 5 meters away. But if you don't have the theoretical understanding that the hill suddenly goes like that, you can think, well, that's all right. It's only 5 meters away. I can catch it up, if you see what I mean. But it's actually like out of reach. And once it's out of reach, then you go up to 23 degrees centigrade, and that's goodbye human race and all that stuff. And the other thing that's interesting, in a funny sort of way, is this is another non-linear dynamic, right? Which is the human body can only survive within a certain temperature range, right? So, as people might know, there's this thing called the wet bulb effect, which is 35 degrees centigrade, 100% humidity or something along those lines, and basically the body dies in 6 hours because it can't cool itself down. So there's an absolute upper limit to how much the human body can live. And that's set, you know, it's done. It doesn't matter how healthy you are, 6 hours and you're dead. Now, if it approaches that, it can do you in and you're not dead, if you see what I mean. So it's not that healthy to be 30 degrees. And often it's not 100% humidity, and obviously you can have, you know, be inside and all the rest of it. The point is at a certain point, so this is the population, other things being equal, and at a certain point, which is this wet bulb effect, the whole population dies. And it goes, it's a vertical downward thing. So it's not like, hey, we've got some heat, it's a little bit of a problem, it's more of a problem. It's like, bang, you know, you've got 3 million people in Karachi died in a weekend. And this is already happening in the animal kingdom, as you may know. You know, like certain, you know, 200,000 deer or whatever on the Russian steppe, it gets to a certain temperature, the the physicality of it basically means they all die. And we all, I mean, people are fairly unfamiliar with that one, but they're fairly familiar with this one. So this is the population, you know, you go out with no clothes on at night, let's say, and it gets colder and colder. And when it gets to minus 10, or whatever it is, you can look it up, then you get hypothermia. And by the end of the night, you're dead. That's it, right? There's no two ways about it. So, let's say that's minus 10 for the sake of argument. So at minus 12, at minus 7 rather, you're still going to survive, right? Everyone's going to survive. They're just going to get really chilly. But at minus 10, everyone dies. And then at minus 15, it doesn't matter because everyone's dead. So what we need to sort of consider on this, of course, is once you're dead, you're not coming back. Okay, so unsurprisingly, that's a fairly basic one, isn't it? But it's surprising. Yeah, I know. You can see I'm beyond depressed. Okay, so what we have here is I think what's that philosopher called? He has this thing, doesn't he, called the critical zone. Bruno Latour, is it? Latour, yeah. So I think he's got this idea of the critical zone. Yeah. And I think he nicked it from me because I had this idea as well. All right, so the basic idea is people say, right, we've got the planet, which is pure bollocks, right? We haven't got the planet. We've got like 12 inches of soil and 200 meters of atmosphere. Because below, if you remove the soil, that's it, everyone starves. And if you're more than 200 meters above sea level, other things being equal, you can't really grow food. You know, I mean, maybe 400 and, you know, there's variations. But basically, we just live on this tiny little slither. So again, this is a theoretical idea. Most people think, oh, we've got this big planet and it's going to be fine. But we haven't. We've just got 12 inches of soil and the atmosphere. So usually a species has a little slither it can live amongst. And once it hits the trigger point, then it goes into terminal decline, as it were. So people have got this idea now because of COVID, right? So with COVID, people have got the idea there's this R number, haven't they? And if the R number goes above 1, it means more people are becoming infected than not infected, and everything goes up, right, exponentially. But if it's less than 1, it means less and less people are becoming infected. So they're infecting less people, so less people are infected, and then it goes. So basically, you make COVID extinct. So the same principle applies basically with extinction, which is it's not a single event. Basically, extinction is when the death rate is greater than the birth rate. You see what I mean? So there's a certain point of no return. There'll be still lots of humans there, but they're basically in terminal decline, if you see what I mean. So where is that point? So arguably, you know, well, not arguably, but almost definitely it's at 5 degrees. Because at 5 degrees, it's 10 degrees inland. But you only need like a few days of it being 50 degrees, and you hit this, right? Because the following day, the temperature can go back down again, right? So you only, you know, for the sake of argument, you only need like 2 weeks of the year for it to be 50 degrees centigrade to kill, say, 25% of your population. You see what I mean? So once it gets to here, basically that's the extinction point because you're terminally in decline. So let's say 25% of your population dies every 5 years, and you know maybe people are born, so it goes up by 15%, but it means it keeps going down and down until it gets to 0. And another sort of error, I suppose, is I'll finish on all this. So here's the probability curve, right? So we could be at 5, you know, we could be at 3 degrees here, we could be at 1, we could be at 5, right? So if X basically means some crap's happening, and Y means some other crap's happening, right? So you have to add them up to find how bad things are. So this is like a probability thing. But there's a 0 possibility of hitting extinction, right? In this scenario. So this used to be the old idea, which was we were going to head to 2 degrees centigrade, it was going to be pretty bad. This is the global north and this is the global south, and you add them together and that's how bad it's going to be. Now, metaphysically, right, there's something totally different with this scenario. In this scenario, like this is the 5 degrees scenario, let's say for sake of argument, there's this terrible thing happening, there's this terrible thing happening, but there's also a 10% likelihood of extinction. So if there's a 10% likelihood of extinction, then it's sort of like x plus y plus a percentage of extinction. So if you think, this gets a bit complicated, but in mathematics, if you take extinction is a bit like infinity, it's like the end forever. It's like negative infinity. Do you see what I mean? That's it for the rest of infinity, there's going to be no human beings. I mean, just think about it for a minute, right? That's what extinction means. So if you're trying to do a risk analysis, basically it's x plus y plus a percentage chance of extinction. Well, if you divide infinity by half, it's still infinity. You can check it out. Just take my word for it. Okay? So in other words, like, as soon as you hit what you might call a substantive chance of infinity, then you're in a completely different ballpark, morally and biologically. You see what I mean? It's not like, we're trundling along and it's going to get pretty bad, No, we're trundling along and then we're going to have a 10% chance of extinction, which basically is off the scale bad, right? In purely rational terms, you shouldn't, as soon as there's a chance of extinction, then the whole civilization is morally and psychologically fucked to even consider doing it. And of course, what we've got here, as we've identified, is, looking at the facts and figures, if you're at 5 degrees centigrade, you're in the ballpark of almost certain extinction, right? Because you're going to destroy the food supply. So that's the end of the physical science bit, right? The natural world and what's happening to it. And so what I've attempted to do is say you're going to understand intellectually, or you're going to understand what's happening with the climate if you understand the broader framework. You see what I mean? Of our extreme vulnerability, of nonlinear dynamics, etc., etc. And I'm going to continue that theme right through this talk. Like, this isn't a talk. It's going to try and understand intellectually why there's a major problem in terms of our strategy. And dare I say it, this feeds into beyond politics as a radical flank of XR, or I don't want to get into specifics, but why my basic thesis is we have to be super, super radical, right, in order to maximize the probability of maintaining a semi-organized society in the next 30 to 50 years. And it's an intellectual exposition, as you might say, of that point of view. Right? It's not an intuition. It's actually focused on a theoretical framework, and I'm going to try and provide evidence and a logic to it in the next hour or so. Right? So there's two sort of core sort of fuck-ups about the human race, basically, is I'll do one at a time. So this is the first one. So this is my most important chart in the world. It's my most important chart in the world. Okay, so what this identifies is that human beings do not make rational sort of assessments of how bad something is. And it's mainly that the amount of time or arousal or effect or emotion or attention that they give to something has a relationship to how far away it is, either in time and space. Okay? And the relationship is a power law curve. So a power law curve basically means it's flat here, and then it hits about here, and it goes, right? So it just speeds up. So let me give you the example, and then you can see it. So let's say 1,000 deaths happen, right? 1,000 deaths are constant. That's the constant. It's a constant reality. 1,000 people have died. let's say in a natural disaster for the sake of argument, right? So if it happens in China, right, which is a distant, far away, then let's say 5% of the British population will hear about it, will talk about it. So I'll just give you a little example, right? Everyone can be honest here. Which country in the world has just lost 200 people in social disturbances? Does anyone know? 200 people have been shot dead, hacked up, whatever, slaughtered in a country in the world. So, no. So you're all, really ethically connected, sus people, but the four of you don't know where it is. Why is that? Because the papers didn't tell you, right? You have to look about the 10th item down on the Guardian website, and it was on there for about a day. So it's in Ethiopia, like a pop star's died or something, and there's been riots. So this is nothing to do with even people that are really, this is everyone, right? It's like, if you're really sussed, you might be here, but you're not going to be here. Okay, so if 1,000 people, you can see how it works, right? Yeah. So in 1,000 people in Italy, then maybe 20% of people in the UK talk about it, right? If it's the UK, it's going to be on the front pages, right, for the next month. So you see that power law curve? You see what I mean? Like, you see an earthquake in southern Italy, right? 1,000 people die. It's like, oh, God, that's bad. It's like, what else is happening? Well, if it's in the UK, it's a bit like you've got special reports from Manchester, and you see what I mean? And if it's in your own town, it's like, so it's basically talking about it 30 years later and still going to therapy, and you see what I mean, because you're traumatized. So even though this is constant, right? So for 30 years, everyone's said in the climate change industry, there's a complete consensus that this is the head fuck situation because climate change is down here, right? So even though it's 20 million deaths or 6 billion deaths or human extinction, it's still right down here because it's not like banging in your face, okay? So that's a problem. That graph could be put on the gravestone of humanity as whoops, evolutionarily sort of buggered. And all the fatalists look at this and they go, that's it, game over. But so this is herding for you. This is another sort of fuck up about human beings. But that's because we're mammals, right? So all mammals, broadly speaking, are herd animals. What herd animals do is, if everyone's running that way, you run that way as well. And this all sounds a bit demeaning for people that don't like to think they're mammals, but there's a big literature about it, and it's just the way it is, right? So I'll give you a little example of how herding works. I mean, it's quite amusing, but anyway. So this is Roger here, that's me. And I'm in a field because I live in the countryside. So I actually do a bit of the maths on this. I've done a bit of the maths because I'm a bit nerdy. But anyway, there's the gate, right? So these are the cows, okay? So the cows don't like me, okay? So there's cows here, do you get it? There's all these cows, and I'm heading towards the gate. Now, if the cows are being rational, they would go, these cows here would go, hang on a minute, there's this nasty human being coming in, we'll run that way, right? That's what they should do, rationally. You see what I mean? But everyone knows they don't. If I walk along here, these cows will run straight in front of me. Why? Because it's like the centre of gravity, which is mathematically, it's at the centre of the herd. Now, if I catch one, he might run that way, because, but broadly speaking, you see them, they all start running, and they'll run across me, which doesn't make any sense. You see what I mean? From a, predator point of view. But they'll do it anyway. So obviously the moral of the tale is, here's the cliff, as it were. So that even though you're trying to tell everyone about climate change, they're all still running off the cliff because everyone else is. You see what I mean? So this is another total headfuck situation because, one, people don't realise it's coming, and when it's coming, they're still going to be following everyone else. So it's not that great. So this is the most important graph of this talk. So if you don't remember anything, remember this. All right. So in my original sort of heading for extinction talk, What I said was, you go and tell people the truth, and you have what's called a bifurcation system in the room, which is 70% of people get depressed and go home and don't want to do anything. And 30% of people go, oh my God, it's really bad, I'm going to do something. So it bifurcates, which is a posh word for it splits. So this takes us back to this, right? Because psychologists for 30 years were going, if you tell people the truth, everyone gets depressed. No, because it's a complex system. Some people flip the other way. So it's not like the positive psychologists were wrong, they were just incomplete in their analysis. And of course, the hypothesis for Extinction Rebellion was those 30% will be the 3.5% of the population which will force structural change. So you don't need those 70%, no disrespect to them or anything, but just analytically speaking. So that was the sort of pivoting to the real issue hypothesis, right? It's like, we've got it. We go out, tell people the truth, they become radical, and then we go and sit in London, we get 5,000 arrests, and the government's forced to act, right? That's the takeaway line of Extinction Rebellion. Okay, so my proposition is there's a fatal flaw, to quote XR Justice. I quite like that. It sounds just dramatic, isn't it? There's a fatal flaw. Okay, the fatal flaw is herding, right? So what happens is in XR is here's all the original members going, we're fucked. And, we've got to do something. So all these people move into XR. And they're loads more radical than society because they know that climate change is happening. But they don't go to what I call this truth line here, which is the line at which you should be in order to successfully change society, right? So this is a little bit complicated, but I'll do it one bit at a time. So the XR centre ground is here, right? And so what happens is, the reason why it's all clumped here is because of herding, right? Because everyone wants to be in with the main guys, right? So if you're a little bit conservative in XR, you go, okay, I'll go and do some rescue sport. And if you want to go to prison or something, you go, oh no, I'll just get arrested. You see what I mean? So although the original people were here, or let's say they were here for the sake of argument, then what's happened is, as it's grown, it's just been in the middle ground, which isn't where it needs to be. It needs to be here on this objective truth line, if you see what I mean, in order to properly change society in the amount of time we've got left. So this is where it needs to be. This is the optimal point, right? But my argument is that you might say, well, that's good, Roger, it's moved a little bit. But if you come back to this, if you come back to the 5 degrees, that might, this might get us to 7 degrees, this might get us to 6, and this will get us to 2. So it doesn't matter, we're still going to go extinct. You see what I mean? That's you can't prove it, of course. It's difficult too. But basically, this is still an extinction territory. In order to not go extinct, we need to stay below 2 or whatever it is, or this is this line here. And so this line here, of course, is what I'm calling postmodernist truth. So this is the idea that the truth is we can carry on consuming loads of stuff because everyone else is, and that's the truth. But it's a postmodernist truth because it isn't connected to any reality. It's true because people think it's true, which is fine when you're talking about art, but it's not true when you're talking about geophysics. When you're talking about geophysics, it doesn't give a damn what people think, right? The truth is that if we don't slash carbon emissions in the next 5 years, we're going extinct. You see what I mean? So this is a problem. All right, I'll just give a little example. You could call this the 38 degrees problem, but it's like a structural problem in social movements, which is they're set up by radical people, and then loads of liberal people join them, and then they become conventional, right? So I think in 38 degrees, it was quite left-wing and what have you. Loads of liberal people joined, and then it was democratic, and so everyone wanted to just save trees or whatever, rather than bring down the government, let's say. So you can see how this is a structural problem. There's other sort of elements here that tend to sort of reinforce, I'll just go through them fairly quickly, reinforce this herding mechanism. Okay, so one of the problems is institutional inertia, which basically means everyone in the organisation knows they should be more radical, but no one's moving. So like at King's College, you know, I went on hunger strike, went to see the vice principal, and he said, yeah, I agree with you, Roger, we're heading towards extinction, you know, we've got existential crisis. That's euphemism for it, isn't it? It's like, so I was going, so why hasn't anything changed? Well, it's just really difficult to change things. So in other words, like everyone in King's College wanted to change, but no one could because everyone was waiting for anyone else. It's a bit of a bystander thing. But it's also called a collective action problem, which means like everyone wants to get there, but no one wants to stick their head above the parapet, if you see what I mean, because everyone's just doing their thing. So maybe people in XR think they should be here. They sort of know that, but you know, no one's really moving, and everyone thinks they can't move because, you know, no one else is moving. The other thing is like people tend to anchor themselves around the centre of the herd. In other words, they'll say, we did really well because we got 1,000 people on the street compared with 500 people last month. So in other words, their anchor is the 500 people. Their anchor isn't the 5,000 that we need in order to not go extinct. So they think we did really well because they're anchored. And that's the default mental sort of way of thinking, is you think, oh, we're here now and we're going over there, rather than thinking, we actually need to be 2 miles away. So it doesn't matter that we've just got, you know, it doesn't matter that we've just got 500 people in the street. You see what I mean? So you delude yourselves by sort of progress, as it were, by limited progress. Okay, another thing is if someone suggests that you move over there, then they get into trouble, not mentioning any names. So you've got an in-group, out-group thing, which is another element of herding, which is, look, if you're going to suggest something outside XR or outside your organisation, you're a bad person because you're undermining the culture. You're undermining the solidarity of us all. You see what I mean? So it becomes quite difficult to actually do it. And then two other aspects of it are loss aversion, which is, you know, if we try to be, if we go over here, we'll upset the general public, and we could lose. So it's best to be safe. It's loss aversion. It's best to be safe because at least we're not going to lose anything. But what they don't think is, well, we're going to lose everything anyway unless we risk doing it. You see what I mean? But that's quite difficult to understand because, of course, because climate change is down here and it's quite far away. Okay, and then the other thing is like pragmatism, which is, look, if we go down here, we're even further away from society, so we become irrelevant, right? So it's the pragmatism argument. So this is what the Green Party does. You know, why the Green Party, no disrespect to the Green Party, but what the Green Party was saying was, look, we know climate change is really bad, but we don't want to put it in our manifesto because everyone will think we're mad, so we're not going to put it in. Because they're looking at the postmodernist truth, do you see what I mean? Which is, everyone thinks climate change isn't a problem, so it's not a problem, except that's bollocks, because it's a real problem, because it's over here. Because if you put carbon into the atmosphere, you know, temperature increases, people starve to death. That's the way it is, it's regardless. But that's what people think, because that's their reality. And the last thing is gatekeeping. So someone's got a job here, right, running the organisation. They don't want to have to move over there because they might lose their job. You see what I mean? It's like, it's really cosy. I'm on VLE in Extinction Rebellion, you know. I mean, that's I do that, or did do that for lost VLE. I think it's quite cosy, getting paid to do activism. Don't want to rock the boat. And then someone comes along and says, oh, we should be, you know, all going to prison. No, I don't want to do that because, you know, I'll lose my VLE. Or, you know, that's going to disturb the power structure. You see what I mean? So you see, like, gatekeeping in across loads of social movement organisations. which is, I'm just thinking about myself, basically, and my power in the organisation. All right, so you can see, it's not good. It's not good, to use a great English expression. Okay, so an extension of this problem is I've been trying to think about Chenoweth's hypothesis. So Chenoweth is the main sort of social movement theorist, and who's written about this, and her idea is you get loads of people together, to go onto the street, and they bring down the government, or they have structural change because there's so many people doing it, right? So the implicit assumption here is that you should build alliances across loads of groups, because then you get more people on the street, right? You see the logic. And she did a lecture in London, and she was actually saying this. She was saying, right, so the name of the game is to go and do, go out and make all these alliances. Now, the problem with this, there's a structural flaw here. And the structural flaw is that this assumes that what's bad is in everyone's faces. So the classical model here is the Global South civil resistance uprising model, right? So what happens in that is there's a dictator and he's killing lots of people, and it's happening, and you can see it on social media, a variation on the theme of what's just happened in America. And everyone's going, fuck this, we want to get on the streets. But they don't, because they're not organised, and the alliances haven't been made, and no one's taking the initiative, let's say, for the sake of argument. So what happens in the Chenoweth model, you basically get everyone on the streets, and then you have this shift, right? That's the distribution of opinion, as it were, and it shifts over there, which is the new truth, which is everyone should be treated in a fair way. But the problem is, most people think climate change is there. Do you see what I mean? Because it's here. If it was really bad and here, then the Chenoweth model would work, because everyone would just be going, yeah, we just need to be organised to get on the street because it's fucking bad and it's in our face. It's like there's no distance, right? People are getting done in. But when it's up there, if you go to people and say, look, climate change is really bad, they'll go, I'll put it on the agenda in a month's time. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. Because we're all got this problem. They think climate change is down here, okay, but it's supposed to be up here. But it's not, because it's not in your face. So this is a really big problem with the Chenoweth hypothesis, which is really bad news. It's bad news. All right, so I'm going to do my favourite topic, which is the sociology of revolution. So this is a little bit of before we come on to the solution, I just want to take this little tangent, right? And this is quite straightforward, though it's quite mind-blowing. What happens with revolutions is they sort of come out of nowhere. So in a normal situation, this isn't the postmodernist truth. It's the real truth, right? Which is, society's trundling along. It's got a few problems, but, it's basically okay. And then you've got a few people on the long tails here going, actually, it's really crap, but they're sort of exaggerating, let's say, for the sake of argument. So if they're going to get anywhere, they need to move towards the centre. So in political science, this is the idea that parties all move towards the centre in order to get the votes, right? It's a central hypothesis. I mean, it's not totally airtight, but it makes some sort of obvious sense, doesn't it? It's like, what's that guy leading Labour now? Sorry, I've forgotten his name. Yeah, so he's just standard politician. He's going, hang on a minute, climate change, there's no votes in that, so we're going to move towards the centre. Oh, austerity, it's not much, we need to get Middle England, standard Labour Party routine. All right, so, that's interesting. So what happens in a revolutionary situation is that everything's trundling along, and then there's a massive crisis. And the massive crisis could have been building for some time, right? But it hasn't actually blown up. So, in other words, like, there's this problem here, and then suddenly it becomes real all of a sudden. Okay, so I'm just give you a historical example and see how this sort of works out. So if you're over here in the reformist society, this is like a Life of Brian scenario, right? So Life of Brian is going, there's all these dickheads, you know, revolutionaries on the edge of society. They've got no idea what's going on. Everyone doesn't want to have a revolution. Everyone just wants to, you know, watch Facebook or whatever. And then they all split off into all these different groups, right? And the reason they do, by the way, is because this long tail is really long, right? You can be, you know, a socialist, or you can be a communist, and then you can be a Maoist, and you can be a hyper-Maoist. You see what I mean? And, you know, depending upon what you want, you know, blah, blah, blah. But the main point is these people are irrelevant, right? Because society is just trundling along. So I'll give you the example of Russia in 1917. So this is really interesting, I think. So what happens in a revolutionary paradigm, a revolutionary context, and I'm not making any moral judgments, right? In the sociology of revolution, there's lots of liberal scholars. So it's irrelevant whether they think revolution's good or bad, right? They're just looking at the sociological dynamics. So in a non-revolutionary situation, the revolutionaries are just a waste of time, right? So, you know, like when I was 20, I realised revolution was a waste of time after being anarchist for 2 years. And, you know, I knew it was a waste of time until about 2008. And then I thought, oh, yeah, it's inevitable. So I sort of changed. But, you know, it was, right? In the early 1990s, it's like everyone was just going, yeah. You know, everything's broadly okay, unless, obviously, you're in the minority and all that stuff. But, all right, so here's Russia. So there's 3 groups in Russia. There's the reformists. This is 1900, for sake of argument. There's the Mensheviks, and there's the Bolsheviks, right? So the reformists, you know, we just need a little bit more money for the poor people. And the Mensheviks were called Mensheviks because they were the majority in the revolutionary movement. And they were going, yeah, we need a revolution, but, you know, we don't want to be too extreme. And then right here were the total lunatics, which is the Lenin lot, who were going, hang on a minute, we're going to do whatever it takes and kill everyone if needs be or whatever, right? So in the revolutionary, in a reformist context, of course, these people have got a little bit of hope of getting to power, and these people are just way off, and these people are just total dickheads, right? That's the sort of situation, analytically. But in World War One, so there was loads of problems in Russia, but in World War One, that was like, you know, 9/11 times 1,000. You see what I mean? The whole world just went into total chaos. There's millions of people getting slaughtered on the Eastern Front. There was no food, you know, blah, blah, blah. In other words, this situation, which was implicit, came down here. It was super bad, and it was in everyone's face. Or it was over here, right? You know, bad things happened in Russia, and it was suddenly like your son's died. You see what I mean? So suddenly, like, this is what you might call state power here, this line here. So you had all the bad guys, you know, the Tsar up to here, 1917. And then because it was so bad, what's called a fiscal crisis of the state in the literature, in other words, they run out of money, then the reformists take power. So the reformists are in power for, let's say, for sake of argument, 4 months. But it's so bad that the Mensheviks go, forget those reformists, they're so bad, they're not doing anything. We need to socialise the economy. So then the Mensheviks come along and they take control, right? I don't think they did, but anyway, that's pretty irrelevant. I think they did for a little bit, but you know, and then they're no good because they're not as ruthless enough. You see what I mean? And so the Bolsheviks, and they win. So the guys on the extreme in a reformist paradigm have 0 chance of getting into power, while in a revolutionary context, in simple terms, the people on the extreme get to power when the shit hits the fan, when that point comes down to this point. Do you see what I mean? So no one's making any value judgments here. It's not like the Bolsheviks are good or bad. It's just like this dynamic. So just so you think I'm not being super left-wing, same thing happened in 1989. So the poor dissidents, right, they'd been working away for like 40 years saying communism was really bad. But like a lot of activists, they were quite conservative. They're going, we just want socialism with a human face. And, you know, we can have the communists, but they just want to stop having a police state because, you know, we just want to make things a little bit better. In other words, like the reformists. And then 1989 happened, which is, again, fiscal crisis of the state, i.e. the state ran out of money. And suddenly, like, everything becomes possible. So the popular opinion came up. In other words, a right-wing party came up and said, we don't want any socialism. So these poor guys that had been working away for 30 years, they had a little party, and I think they got like 5% in the election, while the Capitalist Party, as you might call it, they got like 50% for the sake of argument. Do you see what I mean? So the guys who were totally opposed to the regime, i.e. the general population, they said, we're finished with all this socialism rubbish, you know, and police state, we just want to be like the West. So they won. And the dissidents, you know, lost. So the dissidents suddenly became like irrelevant. You see what I mean? Because of this non-linearity of change. So what happens in political science? Like there's this idea about Latin America. If you look at Latin American history, what tends to happen, and again, this is the simplification, is you get a really shitty sort of dictatorial regime. And then it's because it's so bad, you get a really extreme authoritarian, you know, left-wing guerrilla movement who, you know, are just ruthless. And so you have the right wing here, and they, you know, all these people are incompetent, as it were. So, you know, they're just running off, you know, buying loads of stuff and everything. So their regime collapses. But it doesn't, it collapses all the way down to the extreme left. And then because the extreme left is so, like, mad, as you might say, they mess it up. And then the right-wing people come back, you know, with a bit of American help, let's say. And then you get the right-wing government again. Okay? So this here is like democracy. So you have a little phase of democracy for maybe 4 months. And then the Liberals get chucked out. So this happens over and over and over again, right? So this is normal democracy, right? So what normal democracy is you're within this band. So it's like people are a little bit bad, and then people come in that are a little bit radical and get rid of them in elections. You see what I mean? So you can see this is the reformist situation. And this is like, you know, continual, this is why you just get endless revolutions. This is my central hypothesis. So most of the people in the political space, all the gatekeepers, all the political commentators, they think we're in a conventional reformist space. You see what I mean? And because they've got evidence for it, which is the Tories win, and then Labour win, and then the Tories win. And there's a few little, you know, rumblings on the edges. Every now and again, Jeremy Corbyn gets in. But broadly speaking, we're trundling along. And there's this little thing called climate change, which, you know, we're going to sort out, right? That's the general position, isn't it, of what you might call 90% of the political space. But what we know is that World War I is going to happen. Do you see what I mean? We know World War I is coming along the road. Now, if you were a Marxist in 1900, you might have said World War I is inevitable. And you know that it's not inevitable, but it's pretty likely because of imperialism and competition between the states, right? So the Marxists, the reason why the Bolsheviks stayed super extreme is because Lenin had this bright idea. There was just a matter of time before all the imperialist powers were going to beat each other up. There'd be a major collapse of state authority and the Bolsheviks would run in and win the day. And he bettered right? So what we can say is Lenin was probably pretty much correct, but it wasn't an absolute guarantee because it was World War I was a social construction. Do you see what I mean? It's not like, it wasn't guaranteed like driving a lorry at a wall at 70 miles an hour and you're 5 meters away, right? You see, it's more like, it's pretty likely, like, you know, yeah, like a political prediction. And the same with 1989. Like, no one knew 1989 was going to come, but you know, maybe you could have predicted it because in the sociology of revolution, you have this idea, as I say, the fiscal crisis of the state. So what happens is basically a state gets more and more into debt, and then it goes exponential. Because if it gets more into debt, it gets even more into debt, and it borrows, it gets even, you see what I mean? So it's a bit like a bubble. So this is what states do, and then they collapse, and then everyone goes hungry, and then they're on the street, and then there's a revolution. That's the classical sort of model. So what I'm suggesting is that an ecological 9/11, as I call it, is inevitable. It's not just lightly like World War I, right? Because we're not talking about a social construction here, something that's, likely to happen because of social forces. What we're talking about here is a lorry going at 70 miles an hour into a brick wall with 5 meters to go. You see what I mean? In other words, it's a physical thing. So we can say with absolute certainty that at some point there's going to be an eco 9/11. So it might be a small one, or it might be 2 or 3, or it might be a massive one. And the reason why it's going to come out of nowhere is because of this, right? So you see how the stories coming together, right? You thought, oh, what's he going on about population? So the population's trundling along, and then it's going to suddenly hit that tipping point, and millions of people are going to die, particularly in the global south, or maybe with tens of thousands of people. So a little example of this is like Phoenix in Arizona. So you talk to the engineers in Phoenix, Arizona, and they say, I read an article about it, what they're saying is, it's just a matter of time, right, before it's 55 degrees centigrade and the air conditioning fails. You see what I mean? So once that happens, you're going to have like 50,000 deaths in Phoenix. A bit like, what happened in New Orleans, right? The water's rising, the walls are crap. It's just a mathematical certainty. You can't predict exactly when it's going to happen because obviously, but you can predict with absolute certainty that it's going to happen. Like, a final example is Florida, right? Everyone knows Florida is toast. It's like built in. It's 2 meters off the ground or whatever. It's got limestone. You can't build a wall. The water rises. It's a sort of put the kettle on to boil scenario, right? So what we can say, we can't say how big the ecological crisis will be, but what we can say is it's going to be a big bang type thing, okay? And then, as I said, it could be a number of them. And then what's going to happen, if you follow the sociology of revolution sort of literature, is something along the following lines, which is the Greens are going to get into power because they're the reformists. And you can see this at the moment, right? In France, they've just won the elections. They've been at it for 40 years. So they're similar to the dissidents in this example. They're similar to the reformists, right? They've been there. They're nice people. They want a nice, clean transition to a nice green economy, which is never going to happen because the geophysics have wiped that one out. You see what I mean? So what's going to happen is I put XR here, but you can see if there's something more radical than the Green Party, for sake of argument, the Green Party is going to get into power. They're not going to be able to sort it out because they're all reformists. They don't want to force people to change the economy. You see what I mean? So everyone's going to go, they're rubbish. Who else is there? So everyone's going to move to the left. So then there'll be an XRS party, dare I say it, and they will come in next, right? And then there might be, so the next party, and this is the crucial sort of crux of it, is maybe the next party is super radical and super democratic, right? So that's good because they'll sort it out. They'll bring in all these, structural changes in 6 months. And they're also decent people, right? Because they're Democrats. But there's a certain point where you move into left-wing or right-wing fascism, if you see what I mean. So the next guys are going to be like Trumpians or whatever. You see what I mean? Because that brings us back to the US, to the South American example, which is if things are so fucked, like the reason why this happens in South America is because the social inequality is so extreme. You've got 5 guys run the whole country. So what you get is you get a massive fascist sort of thing, and then you get a left-wing fascist sort of thing, and they're just flipping backwards and forwards like that. So we've got this like small window of opportunity to sort of be here. So we're coming back to the rationale that the most realist position to have is here, not here, because this is the reform space, right? But in the revolutionary context, this is only going to be around for a small amount of time. My final bit is going to be how you maintain that position in the face of herding dynamics, right? All right, so I'm going to give a few sort of approximate ways in which you can stay at this point. And some of them aren't particularly politically correct, but I'm just being sociological about it, right? Like, if anyone deviates, you shoot them. It's always a good move. But historically, there's ways in which you maintain this position, right? So the first one is leadership, right? So you've got one guy, I mean, I'm going to use an extreme example, right? So you've got one guy who basically says, this is where we're going to be, and this is where we're staying, and I'm deciding, and if you don't like it, you piss off. You see what I mean? So you don't have herding, in other words, okay? And I'll expand on this. So herding is a sort of popular collective process, right? But as we know, you can sort of lead the herd as well, in a sort of Old Testament sort of sense, yeah? And a sort of subplot of this is when there's a crisis, sociologically, when you see a crisis, that's when leaders emerge. When everything's nice and calm, you don't really have big leaders, right? You know, it's a bit like Churchill won the war. It's a bit like you had mundane leaders and suddenly you had a main leader, for better or worse, right? Why? Because someone needed to take control of the situation and do what was necessary. You see what I mean? So you gave control to this one guy, you know, who's trusted and blah, blah, blah. And incidentally, there's a Churchillian sort of dynamic here, isn't there? Because in 1937, Churchill was going, we're going to be fucked in World War II, and we should rearm. And everyone's going, no, it'll be fine. Hitler was, you know, he's an okay guy. He's just going to reunify a few Germans. He's not going to try and take over Europe. And then, so all the reformists were going, or the appeasers were going, yeah, you know, it's all fine. So these were the sensible guys, right? And then in Munich, or whenever it was, Czechoslovakia, when he took over Czechoslovakia, it was like for the first time everyone was going, oh my God, he's not taking over Germans. He's going to do what he said he was going to do, which was fuck everything up. Then suddenly, like Churchill was propelled into, because he was most extreme in inverted commas, he was propelled into power. You see what I mean? So again, you've got that dynamic, right? When the shit hits the fan, the guys that have been here all the time in the objective truth are propelled into some sort of position of power. All right, so the next sort of politically incorrect one, of course, is Leninism, right? So what does Leninism mean? Leninism is like leadership combined with like authoritarianism, which is, so if you don't know, like Lenin met in a pub with 5 comrades in 1905, I think it was, a London pub, and they said, we're staying here, right? We're staying here, right? We're not going to move. And Lenin said, right, if you want to be part of our gang, we're not moving. We're going for voluntaristic Marxism. As soon as we've got a chance, we're going to take control, right? We're not waiting for the theory of history or whatever. So, you know, super flexible and what have you. So for the next 13 years, like everyone thought he was a bit of a dickhead because he was in Switzerland, you know, just ranting or raving, a bit like Life of Brian, except he happened to be right because the Germans shipped him into Russia to get the Russians out of the war. Okay, so, you know, that's one way of doing it, okay? I'm not saying it's right or wrong. Okay, a more sort of mundane way of doing it is to mobilize like the lower middle class and what I call the upper working class. So most social movements like this, XR is primarily a middle class movement, right? And because it's a middle class movement, it's quite nice, right? It's full of a lot of people with skin in the game. So it's full of people who go, I don't want to get arrested because I've got a contract, you know, or I don't want to get arrested because, you know, I've got a university course coming up. So those people have basically got skin in the game, but they've got a lot of conscience about them, which is why they're in at XR. So in other words, like initially in social movements, you get all the middle class in, but it gets to a limit because it doesn't want to move. In other words, they'll talk the talk, but they won't walk the walk. Okay, because they're intellectual, they really care about it, but they're not going to do anything, which is sums up the green movement for the last 30 years. All right, but once things get really bad, like here, once things start getting bad, then it becomes a more popular issue. And so in order to expand, you've got the structural potentiality to expand into the lower middle class and the upper working class. And that class, that strata of society, is the revolutionary strata in terms of a sociology of revolution. And the reason why it's the revolutionary strata is it's not so poor that it's just got no time. If you go to a lower working class estate, like no one's going to do anything because they're all on drugs and just chaotic family and all the rest of it, right? I'm not making any judgment. I'm just saying, it's just chaos. The upper working class is different. They've got a culture. They might have connections in the labour movement. They've got a tradition. They've got reasonably stable families, for instance. And with the lower middle class, which, they're administrators, got crap jobs in the government. Like, on that meeting we had the other night, there were three job advisors, right? They're the lower middle class. They're the people that are intelligent enough to work out what's happening. They've got some education, but they're still in really shitty jobs and on the front line of the shit that's happening in society. So those are the people who, are going to go open up into a mass movement. They're going to be the mass movement. So you saw this like in France. This is this strata, by the way, that moves to fascism as well. Okay, they move to the left or they move to the right in the 20th century. So you sort of saw this in the French uprising, 2018, right? The rural lower middle class rebelled against the government because they've got a little bit of time, they've got things to lose, but they haven't got loads of skin in the game. While the middle class has got loads of skin in the game, i.e. they're university educated and they've got that ego of, stroke privilege, stroke entitlement thing. We've all had those conversations, haven't we? Where someone says, well, I've got to think about my university course or, blah, blah, blah. And another little example is 2012. So you had the big government grants for student loans, right? So you have all the elite university guys, and they were just, waffling around, not doing anything. But it all got interesting once the school kids arrived, because the school kids were working class, broadly speaking. You see what I mean? So there's a sort of what happens in social movements once they become really radical is there's this transition. So I said this on a video a little while ago, was like in the 19th century, there's the utopian socialists, right? And they were all in their salons and, cafes discussing variations of Marxism or whatever. And they're all real middle class, but they never did very much. And then Marx came along and the anarchists came along and they said, fuck that, we're going to go mainstream. And of course, it was became popular, created political parties and trade unions and big direct action movements. And all the utopian socialists were outraged because they hadn't crossed all the T's. Do you know what I mean? They were going, oh my God, you haven't read this book, and you know how it is. And the Marxists and anarchists were going, fuck that, we're just going to go and, you've got a job to do, which is to, take power and all the rest of it. All right, so that's like a transition thing. Okay, so the fourth idea is deliberation. So in deliberation, it's a big part of XR, of course, is people radicalize through free communication. So if you take this herd here, right? If you see on social media is herding on heroin, right? Because there's no communication. There's just, I think this, and everyone else goes, I think it too. And before you know it, everyone's agreed with each other and what have you. So, but the opposite of that, that's what, direct democracy, it's called, arguably. But deliberative democracy has a completely different frame, which is if you take these people and you take them up here, right, out of the herd and sit them down for 2 weeks, they forget about the herd and they start looking at what the truth is. So in other words, they're going to go over here, which is why citizen assemblies always move to the left, in so much as the left is right, as you might say, right? Which obviously it is, particularly in the present context. In other words, so you've just seen the thing in France, they've all came out and said, we've got to get rid of the economy. But if they're all sitting on their social media in, Toulouse, they won't be saying that. They'll just be going, oh, give us some more plastic or whatever, stuff. They'll just be going, give us some more stuff because they haven't had time and they want more stuff because everyone else wants more stuff, right? It's a fundamental thing. So that's that. But the real, game changer is what I'm calling prophetic transformation. So what prophetic means, at least in the Judaic tradition, is, I'm not an expert, but as I understand it, what prophetic means is you're listening to God, not other people. Or, in the Old Testament, it's a bit like you get a voice from God. Okay? So we're not bothered here about whether God exists or not. What we just need to understand is what this means in terms of herding. So what it means is you're not in the herd anymore, because the herd is humanity, or fallen humanity, as you might say, if you're going to be Old Testament about it. So you hear the voice of God, and God says, the truth's here, right? The truth is my truth, right? Which you might call physics. And so you have this big archetype in the human experience, which is everyone's going to hell, and then someone hears the voice of God and moves here and stays there and sometimes gets killed or whatever, or not, or what the case may be. And, in the Hollywood script, everyone suddenly realizes this is where the truth is, and the whole herd slides this way. You see what I mean? Because everyone gets with the program, and there's a few sub-dynamics. So one of the dynamics is fearlessness. So fearlessness is super attractive. It's a deep psychological human trait. So if someone comes along and says, I'm going over there and I'm fearless, everyone goes, well, yeah, maybe that's good. Because, maybe it's a sort of semi-herding thing. But a more fundamental point here is that all the dynamics of herding are basically materialistic, if you see what I mean. They're basically saying, I'm going to lose money, so I'm going to stay here. Oh, I'm going to lose power, so I'm going to stay here. Oh, I'm going to lose friends, so I'm going to stay here, right? While the prophetic tradition is basically spiritual, and it's outside, metaphysically, it's outside the material world. So to take a sort of ideal type sort of construction, i.e., a really extreme construction, what the prophet is concerned with is the fight between good and evil, let's say. And it doesn't matter whether he's going to win or not, because that's God's will, right? What matters is there's evil, there's God, good, and I'm entering into that battle. And it doesn't matter what happens. And it doesn't matter what happens to me, and it's irrelevant to my material situation, my family situation. So obviously there's variations on the theme, right? Some people aren't that extreme, but you can see there's a paradigm shift, right? From the material world to the spiritual world. And you can see this in many people's lives. This is why people have a midlife crisis, I think, is because the material world, they realize the material world is just one construction. When you're young, you tend to think the material world is the world, right? But when, one sort of dynamic here is once you know you're going to die, suddenly the material world becomes a little bit irrelevant, which is why people become more religious or conservative or whatever as they get older, because they're not that bothered, if you see what I mean. So, that's another sort of construction of it. So the practical outcome of this, of course, is virtue ethics. So the essential element of virtue ethics is you're not concerned about what happens. What all you're concerned about is doing the right thing. So again, if you want to juxtapose it in a sort of ideal way, you can say like utilitarianism is what's in it for me? Is it going to improve anything? Now, the problem with utilitarianism, as we all know, is it's subject to herding mechanisms. In other words, like you go for the postmodernist truth because that's what's going to give you material progress. You're going to rise up in society if you follow the main truth of society, or you're going to get lots of friends, or you're going to get a good girlfriend, or whatever, right? Like, in other words, like that, you're going to get on. That's utilitarianism, is getting on. But like virtue ethics is like, no, the core question of virtue ethics is it right? In other words, you're here because this is the truth, and that's just what other people think. So the truth is we're all going to die unless we get the climate sorted out very rapidly. So you can see how this, if you want to maintain this optimum point, sociologically speaking, I'm not making any value judgments here, sociologically speaking, you have to have this prophetic orientation. And obviously that can you can create a herding mechanism around the prophetic orientation, if you see what I mean. All right, so this is my sort of slightly mystical ending, right? Which is, so I'm proposing that there's a sociology of miracles, you see, which is everything from a material analysis, everything's totally fucked. This is all material analysis, right? But there's also this sociology of miracles means that in the human experience, there's loads and loads of examples of people taking on a prophetic orientation and saving society. Like it's a central archetype of the human story, which is why, 50% of Hollywood movies are variations on that story, aren't they? It's like someone's trundling along, shit happens, everyone else succumbs to the shit, and the hero goes, I'm not. And then the story is he wins, or she wins. You see what I mean? And why is that? So my proposition is the reason why that is a universal story is that human beings are not just herd animals. So herd animals don't have a conscience, to be a bit philosophical about it. But human beings do. So the basis of hope in inverted commas is that if people will take on a prophetic orientation, they'll go here. But there's a massive paradox, of course, which is that only when they give, hope is a utilitarian construction. It's like, I'm doing this because I'm hoping something's going to happen. I'm hoping there's going to be an outcome. While the paradox, of course, is the prophetic orientation has nothing to do with hope. It has everything to do with honour and duty, and do you see what I mean? So it's like you can flip around on it. You can go, well, there's no hope, then there's hope. And then you go, well, there's hope, there's going to be no hope, right? So in mysticism, this is just standard routine, which is there's no resolution logically. So you can work that one out. It's beyond my pay grade. But the upshot of it is that's where you're going to sort of end up. I'll just give you one example, which is the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943, I think it was. So the idea, the reality of the situation was it's 300,000 Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, or thereabouts, and the rumours came down the line that they were going to take the Jews to Auschwitz and kill them. And, there was massive denial, as you can imagine. It's just a human reaction. So again, I'm not making any moral judgments, I'm just telling the story. Okay? So these rumours increased and increased because people were being told, we're going off and taking you to do some work and, all this thing the Nazis did. And then the rumours became so evidenced, as it were, that there was a flip point. So up to that point, everyone was just in passivity, if you see what I mean. They were in hope. They were going, we hope the Nazis are actually not that mad, stroke evil, and we'll get through it because, no one's going to kill people. So they had this hope, and then all the evidence started coming in. There was no hope. And then there was a flip point. When it got to 60,000 people, there was a flip point where they realised there was no hope. They're all fucked. The Nazis were just going to kill them all. They'd already killed 240,000 of them. And at that point, they all revolted, which contradicts the whole materialistic analysis of Western society. You see what I mean? The whole 30 years of the climate change industry is just like, poof, you can't explain it. You see what I mean? And then they went into revolt, and they were just massively like motivated. So when you lose hope, you can become massively motivated. Because you might see me like talking today, I'm quite cheerful, right? Because I don't have any hope. I mean, I'm quite happy that there might be, but that's not part of my equation any longer. So I'm just like going, I'm going to have a great life. I've got another 30 years left, and I'm going to do whatever I can to fight those Nazis. You see what I mean? And so, if you see the film, you can see the pianist. I think you can see it happening in that. And they all go, right, let's do it. And everyone gets a lot more happy, of course, ironically. And some of them did survive, just if you want to know. But, so that's it. That's what we're heading towards. Welcome to history. That's the end.